The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatis, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Those who followed the Phillies in 1964 are very familiar with the story. Up by 6.5 games with 12 to play, the first-place Titans lost 10 in a row and handed a pennant that was theirs for the taking to the St. Louis Cardinals. Ever since that infamous season has haunted Phillies fans who, in the deep recesses of their minds, believe if anything wrong can happen, it will. For Carl Wolfson, the swoon was a coming-of-age story that he finally put into print last year, titled Slide, the baseball tragicomedy that defined me, my family, and the city of Philadelphia, and how it all could have been avoided had someone just listened to My Lesbian Great Aunt. The book is a must-read for those fans who grew up in the tri-state area and lived through the greatest collapse in baseball history. Wolfson, whose Haddon Township, New Jersey Little League team won one game in 1964, was 11 years old at the time of the debacle. But he survived, even developed a sense of humor about the whole thing. While taking refuge in comedy has allowed so many of us Philly fans to survive innumerable disappointing seasons, humor enabled Carl to become one of the country's top headlining comedians. During the 1980s and the 1990s, Wolfson was a fixture on national television, appearing on The Joan Rivers Show, VH1's Stand-Up Spotlight, An Evening at the Improv, and Showtime Comedy Club Network, among others. Between 2007 and 2016, Carl was the host of Carl in the Morning on AM radio 620 KPOJ and FM radio 107.1 KXRY, Portland, Oregon's progressive talk station. Welcome to the podcast, Carl.
Hey, Bill, thank you very much for that fine intro, and it's really an honor to be with you. I don't know anyone who has chronicled the Phillies in book form more prolifically than you have, so my congratulations to you as well. I just finished your book on Dick Allen, your second book on Dick Allen, and like you, I'm hoping Dick will be in the Hall someday.
Well, we will make sure of that. And I again enjoyed your book tremendously, and I feel it is a must read. Even if the young listeners weren't around at that time, they'll get so much more out of it. Tell us, Carl, what does it feel like to be a diehard Phillies fan exiled to the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest?
Well, I have a friend up here who said he's a Phillies fan too, and he said you never count the Phillies in and you never count them out. And let me tell you, I have been a Phillies fan since 1963. Actually, my family moved from Alexandria, Virginia, up to South Jersey just after Labor Day in '63, and a neighbor took me and his own son to a twilight doubleheader at Connie Mack Stadium. And in the first game, I watched Chris Short defeat Sandy Koufax in an incredible game. That was my first major league game. I've been a Phillies fan ever since. And to answer your question, they're Phillies fans far flung across the country and the world, and we follow the Phils on Major League Baseball, on TV when we can, on the Internet. And once a Phillies fan, always a Phillies fan as I'm concerned, and they've got a great young nucleus that was on display this year. I think they need, one more big bat and some bullpen help, and they're going to be in the thick of it next year.
Well, I agree with you. In so many ways, too, this last season, because of the 9 in a row collapse, mirrored 1964.
It sure did. It sure did.
And for the sake of our younger listeners who have no memory of ancient history, Carl, let's start with the fateful play that began that '64 swoon when Cincinnati Reds infielder Chico Ruiz stole home, costing the Phils the game, and many believe precipitated the losing streak that cost them the pennant. Now, you were at that game, correct?
I was. I was. And, I've wanted to write this story for so long, Bill. And, of course, the story begins on September 21st, 1964. Our family had been to about a half dozen games that year at Connie Mack Stadium. And, of course, we lived and breathed the Phillies that year because unexpectedly they were the kings of baseball. But my dad and next oldest sister and I were at that game behind the first base boxes. And, it was an infamous play because Chico Ruiz, who was a rookie for the Cincinnati Runs, stole home without a sign. He was not given a sign to steal. He did it on his own with a dangerous Frank Robinson up at bat. Art Mahaffey was on the mound for the Phillies, and I don't know if he panicked, but I remember him freezing. And, I've looked at this, I've looked at pictures of it and thought about it since, and he just kind of froze in mid-windup, threw the ball wildly. Chico Ruiz stole home and ended up being 1-0. A Cincinnati win. Now, there's a lot of conjecture whether that shook up the Phillies and sent them on this 10-game tailspin. A lot of Phillies will say, no, the clubhouse was loose. But whether or not that's true, the myth kind of took hold, even at the time, that freak play caused things to go haywire.
Now, Carl, if you had the opportunity to tell Art Mahaffey what was on your mind, what would you say to the guy? I want to go. This is a book here because my lesbian great aunt Nell is in the subtitle of this book. I had a lot of characters in my family, and none more outspoken than my great aunt Nell, who lived with her partner Aunt Vicky in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and for some reason she did not like Art Mahaffey. Now, I never found out what it was. He was a good young pitcher. But, of course, this play, where he got blamed for panicking as Ruiz scored and made it 1-0, really set her off. Now, Aunt Nell, 30 years before Chris Berman on ESPN, had these crazy nicknames. Chris Berman, of course, had, John, I am not a crock, and all of his famous nicknames. My Aunt Nell, when it was a diehard Phillies fan as well, whenever a player would stumble, like Bobby Wine, if he had an error at shortstop, she'd call him Bobby Wino for a couple weeks just as her punishment. She called Mahaffey when she didn't like him. Tony Taylor, our great second baseman, crossed himself before each bat. She called him the Pope. So when and I had got that was Paul Owens, by the way.
Yeah, that's right. But according to Aunt Nell, it was Tony Taylor who crossed himself. But when Chico Ruiz stole home, what went through my mind was what Aunt Nell was thinking about Art Mahaffey, because she obviously had sent me letters that year. She had phone calls to me, and Mahaffey, as she called him derisively, was always in her doghouse for some reason. So what I thought about at that moment as 11 years old is, God, I can't imagine what Aunt Nell is going through right now.
Well,
Yep.
let's talk to Art about this. I have him listening in on hold. Let me get him on here. Art, you there?
All right.
No, just joking. Just joking. I do know Art. I am going to have him on in a future program. I thought about doing that to you, but that would be too embarrassing.
You know what? I have friends out here in Portland, Oregon, whose best friend is a friend of Art Mahaffey. So they have recommended the book to him. And it's a good question that you raised, Bill, kind of a tangential question, is how members, who are still alive from that 64 team feel about what happened. And I know they've probably put their opinions into print and on interviews for years. I had a chance to talk to Rick Wise recently and get in my book. He lives out here in Portland, Oregon. He was a product of Portland, Oregon's Madison High School here, and he was a rookie on that team. In fact, he pitched his major league debut was the second game of the doubleheader on Father's Day at Chase Stadium, where Jim Bunning pitched his perfect game. So, I've talked to Rick out here, and, unfortunately there are a number of people from that 64 squad who have passed on right now. But, as I wrote this from the perspective of an 11-year-old kid, these were my heroes, and I want to say one thing right up front. One of the great things that you've done in your writing, Bill, is talk about race relations. And as you pointed out, the 64 team was the first fully integrated team in Phillies history. By fully integrated, you mean both Hispanic players and African American players,
right,
such as Richie Allen and Alex Johnson and Johnny Briggs and so forth. And one of the things I point out as an 11-year-old kid is that I was aware of the riots that were going on in Philadelphia because as an 11-year-old at that time, I had already lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy assassination. I was pretty savvy about what was on the news. But as far as baseball, that's what I read, the sports section of the Philadelphia Bulletin. These were my heroes, and it didn't matter to me whether they were, what race they were, what color they were. These were my heroes. And my dad's favorite player always was Richie Allen, now Dick Allen. And so this is a lesson baseball taught me at the time, that you judge people on their talents and for who they are, not any of those demographic reasons. And, good for you for writing about race relations as a backdrop for baseball, but this was a key thing for me to follow baseball at a time like this and learn a lesson like that.
Well, Carl, you've already talked about Aunt Nell, who's my favorite character in the book, the loudmouth lesbian whose protest letters to the Phillies front office not only made her a chronic pain in the ass, but a local legend. I just love the lady. But
yeah, she would write letters to those. She would write letters, Bill, to those. She'd type out to those Einsteins at 21st and Lehigh. and whenever a player, she didn't like them, she said, send them to the Cubs. Even though the Mets were horrible, it was always, send them to the Cubs. That was her answer to everything.
Now, Carl, all of us have interesting characters in our family, but I got to admit that everyone in your family appears to have been a character. And your reference to Richie Allen reminds me of your father. I mean, that was his favorite player. And your father, by your own admission, was a diehard fan and something of a tightwad. That is until the 64 season when he cracked open his wallet for bridge tolls, ice cream, and even a Phillies National League Championship 1964 pennant. Tell us about your dad.
Well, first of all, my dad was pretty cheap. And as my mother's mother, my grandfather, said of him, he invented the limbo trying to get into a pay toilet. In fact, he always referred to Chris Short as the best thing from Delaware since cheap gasoline, because I remember if we were ever going back and forth between, anyone knows back then you stopped for gas in Delaware because it didn't cost that much. And, I still have, it's my prized possession. I have, the National League champions Philadelphia Phillies pennant. That was my dad bought for me at the Chico Ruiz game. Usually we go to a game and, he would not open his wallet. But on September 21st, 64, the Phils were 6.5 games up with 12 to play. The pennant was assured. In fact, a couple days later, the World Series tickets would be printed. Even my dad was opening up the wallet for things like a National League pennant. And, I regret when I went to college, Bill, that I, threw away my baseball cards and a few other things, but I still have the paperback baseball books. I still have that pennant, and I still have the letters from Aunt Nell. So, when you write a book, as you know, the first thing you do is go back to what you have. Your strongest memories is the basis for writing. So I had some source documents to begin this book, and I'll add that one of the first things I did was go to the Multnomah County Library here in Portland and have microfilm sent from, I believe, Temple University Library of the Philadelphia Bulletin for these games, because that was the paper we read, the Evening Bulletin. And Ray Kelly and Sandy Grady were the beat writers that I loved to read as a kid. And I still credit those kind of writers, those scribes, for helping me pursue a career in journalism and broadcasting, because they were really, as a kid, you're learning language, you're learning colorful language, you're learning expression, and I learned it from the sports section. But when I got that microfilm of the Philadelphia Bulletin from 64, Bill, when I went through that microfilm, it all came back to me. I mean, the display ads, the typefaces, the stories I had read in 1964, The Bulletin, I think, ceased publication in 82, but that, again, was another source document. And it's amazing how things like that trigger your memory.
Now, another interesting character is your maternal grandmother. She seems like she would have fit comfortably into the racial dynamics of Philadelphia in the 1960s. You write that when she saw a photo of rookie Richie Allen in the Phillies yearbook, she asked you if, quote, the Negroes were better off in their own leagues, adding that if God had wanted white people and black people to associate, he would have made us the same color. Now, I'd imagine she had some issues with your father, her son-in-law, because his favorite player was Allen. Tell us about Grandma.
First of all, she was my mother's mother, and she did not get along with my father at all because she believed my mom had married beneath her, you know. But, yeah, they shared different political views. Let me tell you, my grandmother, Grams, was so Republican she refused to carry a Roosevelt dime till the day she died, Bill. I remember being 6 years old in her bedroom, and I'd hold a Dixie cup at the lip of her vanity, and she would push the FDR dimes into the cup, which would go back to the bank, and the Liberty head stayed. And when she would visit, of course, she and my dad would just, the dinner conversation was hilarious. My father would say, oh, the Schuylkill Expressway was terrible. And then he'd look at Grams and he said, that's why I went on Roosevelt Boulevard. And she would come back at him with something else. And they never, you know, this is the kind of humor that I grew up with. But the reason I put this anecdote in the book was she was, you know, she also did not like Catholics. She had picked up a rumor that the Catholic Church owned Pillsbury, so no Pillsbury product was allowed in her house. But, you know, this idea, and you did hear it from people, that this idea about segregation, when she said that to me about Richie Allen, the reason I put it in the book, Bill, was that it simply did not compute to me. The Phillies were my Phillies. They weren't going to be my Phillies without Richie Allen. This was another life lesson. And my grandmother, God bless her, she was from a different era. But again, baseball was one of the key factors in helping me understand and be able to bridge the racial divide. And by the way, when my grandmother, she was Aunt Nell's sister, they both died in 1981 within a month of each other. At my grandmother's funeral in Pittsburgh, after everyone left the gravesite, I threw in a Kennedy $50 and a Roosevelt dime. So she's buried with 60 cents. She's buried with 60 cents of Democrats, whether she likes it or not. You know.
Now, okay, you got a wonderful family here, by the way. Now, let's turn your mother.
I want to just say this: the book really is an homage to not only baseball and being a fan, Bill, in 1964. It's an homage to the early 60s, and it's an homage to family, because part of the book also is I had an idyllic childhood, other than the fact that my parents argued all the time. And when we moved to Philly or South Jersey, they went to Chinatown to decorate our living room with some Chinese accoutrements, and they bought these symbols for peace and happiness and put them up, and then they argued for the rest of their lives about which was peace and which was happiness. Now, those are my parents. But the year was idyllic for me in the sense that it was the greatest summer of my life, because my parents didn't argue during the summer of 64, because our hearts tagged along with the good fortune of the Phils. Baseball was our life. That transistor radio was on every WFIL was tuned in on every afternoon and evening. We watched the games on TV. Bison, Bill Campbell, and Richie Ashburn were part of our lives. Everyone loved the Phillies that year, and we didn't have the tension in our family that year. So that's why I write about how important baseball was to me and what it can do to bring people together.
Now, I do want to go on to context and culture, but I would be remiss if I left out your mom. Like her mother, she was a diehard Republican as well as a Phillies fan. But after President John Kennedy was assassinated, you caught her sobbing while watching the television coverage of his funeral, and you asked her why she was crying over Democrat. What a smart-ass remark.
Well, it's
how did
funny
she
because
respond to that?
well, I'm glad you brought that up because one of the things that people remember most is the things that affect them the most, and people of my generation all know where they were during the Cuban Missile Crisis, as I mentioned before, or when they heard that President Kennedy was assassinated, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr. And I was still 10 at the time. We had just moved up to New Jersey. I was in sixth grade and a long block from our house. And the principal, Mrs. Bennett, came in, whispered something to our teacher, Mrs. Holloway, the sixth grade, and she told us the president has been shot. We should all go home. Now, I was thinking shot. For some reason, what was in my head was, shot in the arm or something like that, and that he would be okay. I was thinking like of a Bonanza episode. And I came home, and my mom was in the family room in front of the TV just crying, sobbing, as you mentioned. And the only thing I could focus on was her fierce partisanship, because I know she was for Nixon, and I said, why are you crying over Democrat? And for the only time in my life, my mother slapped me right in the face, and she said he was our president, and sent me to my room. It was only after I went to my room and turned on my little Admiral radio that I found out that he had died, and I felt immediately remorseful for what I'd said. I didn't understand it at the time, but I surely understood it after that. But another life lesson that, even though you're a fierce partisan, it's a good lesson to hear right now. You still understand humanity, and you still understand what it means to be an American and to come together. And, we watched the Kennedy funeral all the days afterward as a family in our family room, just as we watched Jim Bunning's Perfect Game, just as we watched some years later Neil Armstrong step onto the moon. So in many ways, this book is also, as I said, an homage to family.
That is, I mean, the beauty of the book is the way that you shift between the Phillies, your family, and local and national events that were folding in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. There's a lot in Slide that will resonate with those of us who grew up not only in Philly but South Jersey at that time. Yep. There's the references to Scrapple, Wibbage. And
we had just moved there, so it was all new to me. I loved Scrapple in the morning. I never had that before, and we listened to Wibbage radio. So it coming from Northern Virginia, that was all new. Baseball was new, and I was so excited. And, Bill, think about it. What a great year to start following baseball, though I got hooked in the end of '63. But to get hooked on a year when the Phillies, they led the league in triple plays. We had Johnny Callison's walk-off home run in the AllStar Game. Jim Bunning's perfect game on Father's Day, the first one in the National League since 1880. As a kid, you're following baseball for the first time that year? What a gift.
Well, the other part of that is it was also a very turbulent time across the country. You had Kennedy assassination, the civil rights struggle, the Cold War propaganda. And I love that you write in the context of the time period. I write in the context of the time period. Yes. I don't believe that, the reader could truly appreciate what's happening, in the microcosm of the subject unless you look at the macrocosm of the time period. Now, that's why I write in the context. Right. Why did you choose to integrate all that into this book?
I had a feature. I went to the University of Tennessee College of Communications, my undergraduate degree, UCLA graduate school. But I had a feature writing professor at Tennessee who said something to me that I never forgotten. I think it was some of the best advice I've had as a writer. He said, write about what you know and tell the truth. So the core of this book is the slide, or learning to love baseball, the great '64 season, and then dealing with the disappointment of the slide from the viewpoint of an 11-year-old kid. That is the core of the book. So from letters, from interviewing my family, from looking at those microfilm stories from the bulletin, I tried to keep other things out. And I made a conscious effort not to read anything else about the Phillies, to keep as pure as I could my remembrances. But literary nonfiction, which is this genre of slide, you can step out of it. You can look back at it from your perspective now. You can make side comments about it, but you try to stay in the moment because, Chico Ruiz stealing home I'll give you an example. That's probably the best example in the book is Jim Bunning's Perfect Game. I
Right.
remember that day as if it were yesterday, Bill. We were supposed to go out to have dinner at Compton's Log Cabin Restaurant a few blocks away for Father's Day. We were all dressed up, but we couldn't leave because every inning, it became clear that Jim Bunning was 3 outs closer to a perfect game. And, writing as you can look at it, you can look at film of it, you can read stories about it. But I tried to, and I think I was successful in that chapter, of saying how every pitch, how the goosebumps appeared, what my father said, what we were trying to do to relieve the tension. That's the journey that I tell, and you do it by being in the moment. Now, there are times when you can step out of that and talk about it from today's point of view, but being in the moment is what really history is all about.
Right. You said that your professor said, write what you know, and he's absolutely right. But there's another thing that only the very best writers can do. They can combine the talent of the novelist with the talent of the historian or the nonfiction writer, and that is the best writers can both show and tell. Writers who show put their readers right in the moment, as you're suggesting, by actually getting them to feel the atmosphere, putting them in that living room and watching Jim Bunning's Perfect Game, as you did with the reader. Right. It's not just a matter of telling the tale, but actually transporting the reader back into that memory. Right. And I think that you do that wonderfully in the book.
Thank you. Thank you. And I feel the same about cinema as well, and all art, if they can put you there. And I really appreciate the comments from someone who's chronicled the Phillies as much as you have. It means a lot to me that you say that, Bill. And I don't want to give anything away about the end of this book. But I will say that it's probably the only retelling of the 64 Phillies with a happy ending. So I'm going to let people, I love it if you picked it up at Barnes & Noble or any bookstore or Amazon.com or from mascotbooks.com. If you pick it up, that final, the epilogue to the book will probably put a smile on your face and a tear in your eye. But what I try to do in that epilogue also is remind people of the journey they've been on. What 64 meant, and then at the end, if you can leave them with a feeling, expansive feeling of all the distance they traveled from that Chico Ruiz game to the epilogue. I think I think writing that epilogue actually, I have to tell you from writing is rewriting. I don't know how many times you rewrite and edit your own books. I can imagine it's the same as what I did on Slide Bill. And I don't know how many times I've written and rewritten or read over or edited that epilogue, but I still have a tear in my eye at the end of it. I still do when I read it, because it's that emotional to me.
Mm-hmm. For so many Phillies fans who lived through the 64 swoon, there are plenty of nightmarish memories, but you also recreate some wonderful ones. We already talked about Jim Bunning's Perfect Game on Father's Day, but there was also Johnny Callison's home run to win the 64 AllStar Game, the emergence of Richie Allen as a legitimate power hitter and the first African-American superstar in the club's history. You mentioned the radio TV broadcast crew of Bill Campbell, By Som, and a second-year color man, Richie Ashburn, who you called a work in progress. Now, it seems like the Bunning Perfect Game was the most outstanding of those memories. Were there others?
I want to go to what you said about the All-Star Game, because, I didn't know it till later. I certainly didn't know it at the time, that was only the third walk-off homer in All-Star Game history. Stan the Man did it in 55, and I believe Ted Williams did it in I think around 41. But, Johnny Callison was my mom's favorite player. My favorite players that year as a kid were Johnny Callison, Richie Allen, Chris Short, and Cookie Rojas. Callison, and by the way, Bill, can you imagine how many home runs Callison could have hit at Connie Mack Stadium without that right field fence? Yeah. I mean, Johnny was a left-handed hitter, and that right field fence that I think was in 1935 where they moved it up to keep the people from
Fight
seeing
fence.
the games on their rooftops.
Right.
But Johnny was he was sweet swinging. He was an incredible fielder. But a lot of people should remember that he hit that walk-off homer in '64 in the AllStar Game at Shea off Dick Raditz, who the monster, who was probably the one of the great pitchers in baseball at that time. I mean, nobody threw a ball harder than Dick Raditz, the monster. And to me, I mean, that's some weeks after the perfect game. I remember we were watching the game in our family room. My father hustled in late because he had to come from work. But my mother was always like, "Stay back from the TV, you'll get the radiation." But but when he hit that home run, she was leaning into that TV with all of us. I mean, it was, to me, that was just the cherry on the sundae. The Phils could do no wrong. I mean, if you've got, perfect game, you've got Johnny winning the All-Star Game, and I can still see in my mind's eye all the National Leaguers mobbing him at the plate. And then you mentioned Dick Allen. There's this old saying in baseball that whoever's in first place on July 4th will win the pennant. Well, it's a bunch of malarkey, but yeah, it's a fun thing we go with. But the Phillies completed were in the midst of their first sweep ever of the Giants at Candlestick Park, and Richie Allen was 7 for 11 in that series. He had a home run, a triple, 2 doubles, and 3 singles, and listen to this, the pitching staff. I just went back in the book to get this. In that series, the July 4th series at Candlestick Park, the Phillies pitching staff held Mays, McCovey, and Cepeda to a collective 4 for 33. And remember, the Phillies and the Giants were vying for first place at that time.
Right.
I remember being out back on our patio with my mom and dad listening to that game on July 4th. That's another incredible moment. We beat the Giants, moved into first place on July 4th. I mean, any one of these things in any one season for a fan would be, life remembering. But to have all of this in '64 was incredible. And then, like a Greek tragedy, to see it all go away.
Mm-hmm. How was that for you at the end as an 11-year-old?
Well, one of the funny parts of the book is how we as a family were trying all these different things to ward off the losing streak. My mom saw our cat Taffy sleeping on his head, so she attributed our losing streak to Taffy, so we had to keep the cat up so he wouldn't sleep on his head. I decided not to listen to a game. Maybe that was the problem. That didn't work. It was unbelievable because those who listening to this podcast who went through that streak, there were things that never happened all year. There were things that, bad hops and slices down the line and bad calls and Phillies oversliding the bags. Now, I don't know if it was chance. I don't know if the Phillies were trying too hard. They were too tight. Mock was too tough on them. We had Bunning and Short with 2 days rest, whether it was panic. But there were things that just never happened all season. So, of course, as each loss mounted, we were more frustrated. But we were in this surreal state. How could this be happening? So, another organic part of the book is how I kind of turned to humor that time to get us through. But I have to tell you, on that last day of the season, and remember, the Phils won their last 2 games in Cincinnati. Bunning had pitched a masterpiece, and Chris Short pitched well enough. He didn't get the win, but they won those last 2 games. Had the Mets beaten the St. Louis Cardinals that last day, it would have been a 3-way tie for first place. But when the score came in from Sportsman's Park and the Mets had lost to the Cardinals, remember they beat them twice the 2 days before.
Right.
I never had a feeling that low. I mean, I was sitting between my parents on the couch in the family room, and my mother she was sobbing. She left the room and she cried for weeks afterwards. It was just unbelievable. Just unbelievable. There's no other word for it.
Yet another thing that really impressed me about the book is that, the reader is seeing it through your 11-year-old eyes, and now on the 25th anniversary of the film The Sandlot, the nostalgia comes back to my own little league. 64 was the very first very first season I followed baseball, and I simply could not understand why grown men were crying at that time, including my father. And it was really the first time playing Little League. And that clearly was a magical part of that season for you. But as you say, your team only won one game in 1964.
My Little League team. I know. My mom picked out the team. It was the Oakland, which is very close to Haddon Township, the Oakland Republican Club. She wanted me to be on a team sponsored by the Republicans. We were pretty awful. My nickname, which was league-wide, was Lead Bottom because I couldn't run. When my sisters loved to tease me about Lead Bottom, but my most infamous at bat, I only got wood on the ball, I think, 3 times all season. I hit a ball that rolled all the way to the center field fence, and the outfielder picked it up and threw me out at first. So that was the kind of my Little League career in a nutshell. We won one game, and we got pizza for it. But I played third base, and that was another reason I had an affinity for Richie Allen. As you and Phil's fans know, Richie, he was originally an outfielder, I believe, and they moved him to third base. Right. He beat out Don Houck for that job. Mock was a supporter of his then, and if anyone saw Richie Allen swing the bat and hit one out of the park, it was legend. But he had problems with the leather, and he had problems with strikeouts. So when I would make an error at third base, I would kind of grin and my idol Richie Allen also makes errors at third base.
There you go.
We'll call it the hot corner for nothing, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Carl, any plans for any future work on the Phils?
Well, as much as my friends are telling me, you have to write slide 2 about this the 2018 Phillies. But I think I'm done with the Phillies as far as writing because this is as I said, I wanted to write this for decades. I finally had time after I finished radio to finish up the book and get it done. My future in the Phillies are being an erstwhile fan to support them, to get back to Philly. I try to get back to Philly a couple times a year. I started watching games at Connie Mack Stadium, and by the way, Aunt Nell never referred to Connie Mack Stadium as anything but Scheid Park. She was an old-fashioned woman, and she still called the Dodgers Brooklyn till the day she died.
Wow.
But I have to say, Citizens Bank is a fun place to see games. The Vet was, a lot of history at the Vet for sure. It wasn't I wasn't a fan of those ovals, even at the time. But I'm the same kid as I was at 11 years old, and I follow the Phillies every day, read the box scores every moment after the games, and this was a coming of age story for me, and the Phillies will always be my team. And by the way, I lived for 22 years in Los Angeles when I was doing comedy, and I would always go to Dodger Stadium when the Phils are in town. If you live in LA, you know that when the Mets are in town, probably a third of the stadium cheering for the Mets because they're from New York, and we always had a lot of Philly fans out at the games at Dodger Stadium. My hope is, by the way, that Portland, Oregon will get a franchise. We've got a good group of people here in Portland that are putting together a good package, and man, if we could get a franchise out here and then I can see the Phillies in my new hometown, that would be a dream.
Yeah. We've been speaking with Carl Wolfson, author of the book Slide, the baseball tragicomedy that defined me, my family, and the city of Philadelphia, and how it all could have been avoided had someone just listened to My Lesbian Great Aunt, published by Mascot Books of Herndon, Virginia last year. The book can be purchased online at www.mascotbooks.com. I've also seen it at just about every Barnes & Nobles that I have visited in South Jersey, Delaware, and southeastern Pennsylvania. Carl, thanks for being with us and for such a humorous and nostalgic trip down memory lane for those of us who remember the nightmare of '64. It was as pleasurable for me as a root canal. Just joking.
Yeah, Look, we all went through the same thing, and the best thing you could do is look back at it with some grace and humor, and that's what we've done. And Bill, thank you very much. It's an honor to speak with you. And like you, I'm a diehard Phillies fan. And let me just say one last thing. The Phillies never got as much ink as the Dodgers or Yankees or Red Sox. And Richie Ashburn, whom we mentioned, I was at the ceremony where he and Mike Schmidt went into the hall in 1995. But he never got the due, during his playing time, won 2 National League batting titles, because he was a singles hitter for one. He didn't get the due that Mickey Mantle or Willie Mays or Duke Schneider got, mainly because he wasn't in a big market and he didn't hit homers, but he was one of the great ones and big part of this book too. So thank you as a fellow Philly fan for getting the word out about our team.
And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Cachetis, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.
This has been a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.